Hello, everybody. My name is Ian Kirkpatrick. I'm an author, idiot, and loin streamer, and in honor of No Nut November. I meant to do this earlier, but I skipped a week of doing videos. Technically, I skipped 2 weeks, but in honor of No Nut November, we are going to be reading INCEL, a novel by ARX-Han. I am sorry that this is also falling on Thanksgiving, which also, happy Thanksgiving to you. I hope you are not allergic to nuts, but I guess if you are allergic to nuts, there is nutting in this book. I'm not gonna lie, there's nutting. We're in for it. But happy Thanksgiving. Now that the awkward is out of the way. Number one, if you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Number two, if you would like to be featured on the channel, check out the links down in the description below. The number one way to be featured is through Lemoy, the monthly prompt writing contest, where I give you a prompt, you write a short story using that prompt, and on the first Monday video of the month, we bask in your creativity. There will not be any more Lemoys for the rest of this year. However, at the end of December, we do have the cringe stream. So there is that. The second way to be featured is if you are an indie author and you have a book out or a book that is coming out, if you submit your first chapter to the Fresh Meat feature, that chapter will be read here on the channel to hopefully help more readers find your work. I may not be a reader, I may be a reader. It is the time to pitch your skill, pitch your cover, pitch your story, and the intrigue of that first chapter. We got so many different types of fiction on this channel. So many different genres of fiction have been featured through that program, and so hopefully there is something for everybody. It's also a way to bypass my personal preferences, though I do pick stuff out of there. I've had a couple, I have more than a couple of books that I have yanked out of there, even and some of them read here and some of them not read here yet. The third thing is if you would like to check out any of my books to psychoanalyze me, they're available at any of your favorite places to get books, including the local library upon request. My newest novel, Bodymore Zero, came out in October, at the end of October. It features these fine gentlemen right here. With that said, let's jump into this. And Casey is definitely not an incel. I mean, look at him. But with that said, let's jump into this. Now, I don't really remember how I came across this story. It's been a while. I think it was mentioned somewhere. And as somebody who likes to read for the experiences and then bring the experiences to you, this is where we are. So I will look forward to your guys' thoughts and comments on this book. Now, it also started out in the beginning of the book that this is not a manifesto, it is satire. So just keep that in mind as we go. There is also a thing at the end that lists a couple different suicide hotlines. Now, I'm going to talk about that at the end and what my overall thoughts on this book were once we get through it, but do keep those things in mind as we read the story. I've actually really liked starting out the stories by reading the first paragraph or first couple of paragraphs because it kind of gives a good introduction to the style of the story, and it's a better way to share how the story starts out than trying to summarize it. So that's what we're going to do. Quote, I'm talking to the 15th girl I've approached when the switch flips in her brain. After clearing the first set of compulsory checkpoints, hi, what's your name? Come here often? The conversation terminates in the same pattern as all of the others. Something in my words triggers the pragmatic death of the interaction, and the seemingly promising opportunity disintegrates into ashes. Roughly 2 minutes into our exchange, she's converged on the same placid, zoned-out expression as the other girls, a face that feeds into the front-facing sockets of my binocular skull, activating a tiny module of tissue located in my cerebral cortex. The module, a network of neurons dedicated to parsing social cues, slides into the fore of my attention and blares, with bright red klaxons spinning inside of my head, that she is not interested. By the time I've noticed the signal, it's already too late. An ancient female algorithm has definitely determined that my DNA is unworthy of reproduction. Possessed by the protective judgment of her ovaries, the girl reaches into her purse and removes an enormous phone from deep within its insides. As the tail of a sentence uselessly spills out of my mouth, her gaze unhooks from my face and latches onto the screen between her hands. Like an obese asteroid drifting off into space, she slowly floats back onto the dance floor, and it's at that exact moment that the thoughts slam into me face first. This is what it's like to be wiped out at the gene pool. The first thing that you have to understand about evolution is that it doesn't give a fuck about you. You're primordial slime, desperately crawling toward the ocean before a sun kills you of thirst. Underneath the glaring heat of a clear sky, the surface of a rock is roasting you alive, evaporating the precious moisture clinging to your membranes. The slime next to you, still damp and healthy, was born with a mutant protein that helps it retain water under thermal stress. You weren't born like that, so your death is a form of progress. Why? Because fuck you. That's why. So from the start, we're getting this idea of an anal retentive obsessive jerk who measures things out and thinks that if he does something just right, then he should get what he wants. But when it doesn't work out so cleanly, he then blames others. And there is also a superiority complex immediately visible in the narrative, and one where he thinks he deserves everything that he wants, judges others, and gets resentful when he doesn't, despite being so deserving. He also doesn't necessarily see himself as human like other humans. He's at a club and he's in his head, and he only gets pulled out of it by being bumped into and is still judging others and himself, quote, slicing off the boring interstitial parts between conversations to reveal a space for more theoretical observations. If anyone here was truly paying attention to you, they're not. They would not be privy to the incessant mental chatter. The only thing that they'd notice would be the hunger in your eyes. And obviously when he judges hard. Feeling like an observer of human rituals that he can't understand at all, he goes to great lengths to scientifically understand. Quote, ravenous, I'm the passive observer of a mating ritual where I've failed to meet the minimum threshold of participatory inclusion. A libidinally driven polarization of desire created by the pairing of genitals separated only by the decorum of clothing, a process of mutualized engorgement driven by the grinding of hard cocks against curving flesh of supple asses. There is something tribal, something ancestral in this combination of music, alcohol, and dancing, but it's an energy that seems entirely closed to the person. An object that I can view but not grasp, a sort of social hologram. Clutching a gin and tonic in my left hand, I stand relegated to the periphery of this ritual, a grim, self-conscious statue of a man in black jeans and a $50 shirt from H&M that looked better on the mannequin. In my front right pocket is an unused condom still inside its wrapper, the same one that I brought with me the last 20 times. The plainness of my appearance does not bother me. My problems are chiefly sartorial. A 2001 study on average American penis size pegged it as 2.34 inches flaccid and 5.48 inches erect. Unlike the plethora of other studies on the subject which rely on self-report and length, and thus are notoriously unreliable, this study by Greenspan and Company used medication-induced erections and third-party medically trained assessors. Although cultural mores might seek to reduce the worth of an individual male to a single metric, reality resists the crass simplification of reductionism. As according to the latest research in sexology, penile girth combined with penile length is a much better correlate of female sexual satisfaction than length alone. What matters in life is not a single measurement, but rather an aggregate score that subsumes the most biological salient parameter. Turgidity, thrusting velocity, distension altitude of the vaginal wall during repeated cycles of penetration, and so on. This indeed is the superior measure of a man. The only problem with this formulation is that nobody else cares. If you think about it, putting people into scientific categories like this when you're trying to understand the function has a way of looking like you want to manipulate people by cracking the biological code or secret in order to cheat the system, which will leave you always disappointed in the end because while people are predictable, they're also individuals. A girl walks by, micro-rejecting him, and he is miserable, doesn't want to be at the club anymore, goes over to his friend who has zero problems picking up girls. Quote, next to me, my lab mate, Andrew, is comparatively sanguine in demeanor, clocking in at 6'2". He needs neither courage nor skill to win the affections of the opposite sex. Oblivious to my discomfort, he absent-mindedly is bobbing his head to the music while chatting up a 7 out of 10 brunette in a black dress with minimal effort. Andrew won't agree to be Anon's wingman because he's too busy, and yes, the main character's name is Anon the entire way through. Anon walks away to start observing the club again. Quote, to alleviate this strain, I construct an imaginary camaraderie between myself and the multitude of men rimming the wall boundaries of the dance floor, passively absorbing their psychic support of my low-status brothers. The women, in turn, are focused on the handful of conventionally attractive men milling about the center establishment, rendering the rest of us into inanimate objects, slung to the edge of the frame by the centrifugal force of our own inadequacies. From nowhere, a neurological program instantly orders you in relation to your peer competitors, computing the following hierarchy of status. Andrew, alpha male, good-looking guy, grinding against extremely attractive 8 out of 10 blonde girl. Alpha male, myself, and a legion of losers, beta males, fat man in undersized shirts, growing sweat circles around the armpits, sexual non-entity. Overwhelming this analysis, the speakers blare out a never-ending slurry of rap songs written by men below the 50th percentile of intelligence, moderately under average IQ. Much like masculinity, or a propensity towards impulsive violence, is a variable positively correlated correlated with the reproductive fitness. This phenomenon is referred to as natural selection. He sees a couple of Chinese girls that he could possibly talk to. No guy is talking to them right now. He stares at them, debating on if he can actually do anything, and he reasons with himself, quote, "There's simply no other option. Having depleted the available supply of white women populating the venue, the right of necessity drops me into considering second-tier alternatives. In spite of their decidedly non-caucased features, the pair of thin, otherwise conventionally attractive females seems likely to receive my advances with a positive orientation. Although some observers might consider them out of my league, adjusting for the hierarchy of my European genome situates these Mongoloids at or below my mate value. To suppress behavioral circuit that leans towards avoidance, I inform Andrew that I intend to talk to them shortly. If your ethnic group is responsible for almost all of mankind's technological, political, and social progress, women of other races will confer a 2-point advantage over your racially translated male phenotypic equivalent. This phenomenon is referred to as white privilege. Andrew cheers Anon on to go for it. He approaches the girls, greets the taller one, and then wonders why he greeted the taller one instead of the short one. A black guy appears to greet the girls, and they go off with him and not Anon. Anon wishes that he could beat the guy up, or at least that the guy could have respected the social rules of engagement. Ultimately, though, he returns to Andrew saying, quote, "Great. It went fucking great. I'm going to go home and masturbate." "What?" "I said, I'm really drunk and I should probably get going." "Why? You don't have any girls yet. You should keep going." "I'm really tired, man. I've got stuff to do tomorrow morning." "All right, do what you need to do, I guess." He squeezes through people and exits with one last judgment of everyone. Emerging from the chaos of the nightclub, I'm met with quiet indifference of a Thursday night. The street, nearly deserted, is overlaid with a texture of a kind of afterimage, the lingering negation of a prior moment. When passing through a point of transition, your brain remembers that it's a machine tuned to noticing of change. In one space, a lively thrum infuses the air with the vibrancy of hope and connection, projecting a future brimming with a multitude of penetrative potentialities. In the other, only the desolation of continued loneliness remains. The effect of this transition is decidedly deflationary. Although a handful of low-status males are milling about, smoking and chatting, the immediate contrast between the two zones serves to fully evacuate any residual stores of psychic energy. Having passed through an evaluative matrix composed of dozens of potential partners, my value has been determined. In spite of my current level of inebriation, the result of this calculation retains the uncomplicated clarity of a binary outcome. Like rectal refuse, I've just experienced the terminal contractions of animal excretion, cast out like genetic detritus squeezed from a nightclub's anus and onto the concrete panes of the city sidewalk. The second thing that you have to understand about evolution, well, technically it's a corollary, and the first thing is that evolution doesn't give a shit about your personal happiness. Miserable, endless struggle, punctuated by brief spurts of victory. This is the norm, the way of nature. Happiness is merely one among many possible mental states, all of which are subsumed within the greater drive of sexual reproduction. If being miserable pushes you to get laid, then evolution will be happy to make you miserable. He grabs a cab, returns home, picks up a package addressed to Tyler Bateman, which he says isn't his real name. My guess is he idolizes Fight Club and American Psycho. Inside of the box is some foreign substance from Russia and a needle that you're supposed to inject into your penis, assumingly to make it bigger. Anon props himself to do it and has himself laying on a DVD when he decides against the injection. He considers cleaning his room when he lays his eyes on one of his favorite papers titled Male Criminality and Reproductive Success. At this point I said, is he going to commit some crimes as an aphrodisiac or an attempt at an aphrodisiac? Because the ladies love a bad boy, that's true. But yeah, that's not where this goes. That paper never comes in. It's just a reference to one of his other interests or assumptions about things. Instead of shooting up his shaft with this questionable liquid, Anon sits down and masturbates instead. Quote, "Naked and masturbating, you are the wire-headed rodent, contorted into the multitude of positions. A series of females forms dances across your retinas like rapid animals, squeezing down the twin tubes of your optic nerves where they meet with the penis of the POV male actor, jump-starting a feedback loop, insatiated in a complex array of globular, proteinaceous computations. Your brain is transposing your penis into the frames of your screen's avatar, allowing you to momentarily transcend the boundaries of your body. Suddenly, the penis of pixels becomes your own, forming a visualized representation of an alternate dimension where you are the object of desire, a paradise where your swollen member has the functionality infinite choice. A paradise where your swollen member has a functionally infinite choice of holes. Swiping your fingers back and forth over the keyboard trackpad, you submit to the slavery on the screen, to the luminous void that feeds you slop of dopamine from a human trough of curated cavities in various stages of penetration. Dispensing with some semblance of adherence to your stated norms of racial purity, you settle on a 10-on-1 interracial with a tattooed Asian of unknown origin. As she is entered by a collection of caucasoid phalluses spanning a wide range of measurements and morphologies, you lapse further into the hypnotic trance of pure automatism, your fingers grasping the full circumference of your shaft in practiced rhythmic jerks honed by thousands of hours of feedback trained on the dedicated neural network. Inside of the borders of this self-contained subsidiary network, a miniaturized homunculus pilots twin joysticks of fine motor control, routing down a spinal column that flares out onto the body of nerves, enshrouding your shoulder, arm, and hand. Even though the night started off rather poorly, it's rapidly approaching a positive conclusion. He also talks about masturbating all day long if he had the stamina to do it. We're a bit on the addicted side here, and using masturbation as a form of coping mechanism. Something familiar hits the screen, causes him to cry, and he still finishes, discards the tissue, and quote, "For the 95th night in a row, I curl into the fetal position and cry myself to sleep." The next morning, Anon is thinking about the day that he moved in. His brother didn't show up to help, but this high-functioning IT autist did. This is just a flashback while he is laying in bed the next morning, listening to his neighbor's wife having sex with someone who isn't her husband, since the neighbor and the husband have sex at a specific time when it's them. This gets him thinking about his status as a virgin male. Quote, "According to the Center of Disease Control, the average American male loses his virginity by 16 and a half years old. As cohorts of men pass through successive chronological filters, the percentage of males who have managed to mate with a woman increases. At age 18, around 45% of men are virgins. At 19, that figure is roughly 35%. At 20, it's 25%, and at 22, my age, it's about 15%. It's a funny thing to know exactly where you stand in relation to other men. At the bottom, your entire life can be reduced to a single number. 22 years of constant failure. 22 years of your continuous inability to complete the most basic possible task on life's default difficulty setting. By aggregating the anhedonic calculus of human misery into a vast spreadsheet, by aggregating the anhedonic calculus of human misery into vast spreadsheets of populational data, a central paradox emerges from the cells tabulated into the collective binaries of pre- and post-coital males. It's elegant, really, a simple axiom of probabilistic determination. The longer you go through life without a woman accepting your penis into her vagina, the more fucked you will be. On one axis, you're doing absolutely no fucking at all. On the other axis, you're getting more and more fucked every day. Indeed, the statistical association between your age and the ineptitude evinces an underlying causation. That, with each year that passes in the life of a virginal American male, it becomes increasingly harder for him to engage in the act of mating. For the unlucky group of outliers standing in this cursed category, each and every socio-sexual failure compounds upon the previous one, snowballing into the greater and greater psychological handicap that simultaneously reduces the probability of future success while increasing the subject's anxiety around his performance. After threading together numerous personal disasters along the length of a biographical axis, the accumulation of each individual unit of failure precedes a near maximal psychic load, ensuring that a wretched minority of males arriving at the milestone of 23-year-old virginity are virtually doomed to the perpetual stasis of reproductive purgatory. Thus, given its clear relationship to age, the condition is best understood as a chronically pegged disease state. Although an 18-year-old virgin has a relatively benign illness, a 22-year-old virgin has something more akin to a chronic ailment. There you have it. He thinks on how being a virgin basically is a disease that eats you from the inside out, and it takes a little hope from you every single day. Because of this loneliness, he evaluates himself, wondering why he can't seem to get with anyone, and ends on, quote, "Your search has ended. You've located the structural flaw embedded in the foundation of your psyche that, contained within the base layer of your social programming, is an overwhelming revulsion for most members of your species. From this single node of dysfunction, the contagion flickers through adjacent modules of limbic cognition, manifesting as a broad aversion to social interaction more generally, a bias that has often been mistaken for a general lack of emotion altogether. Often, the world has dismissed you for an automation devoid of true feelings. So reveals the fundamental discontinuity between you and others. For the average man in a bar, a conversation is a mere subroutine. For you, it's an excruciatingly painful exercise, a needless elaboration of the intellectual distance between you and the hollow domes of mere mimetic propagators. In your position as a novel derivative from a basic biological organism of the human being, avoidance is your primary mode of failure. It is more or less the one thing that really got you here. From here, he looks at the calendar and counts down to his 23rd birthday because that's his trick to getting laid. He has decided that if he can't swipe his V card before he turns 23, then he is just going to kill himself. This way, there are consequences to his failure tied to his failure that he's hoping will kick in his survival instincts. With that said, I have to share how he says it because the prose is just hilarious. Quote, "I'm going to get myself killed. By tying my potential failure to a self-imposed punishment, I've strapped the engine of self-preservation to my primal drive for pussy, converting the latter into a consistent campaign of action. A promise is a covenant between you and yourself. Either you're going to get laid or die trying." Anand goes over to the syringe medicine that he ordered online and thinks about how it's meant to make your micro penis bigger, but it doesn't really work on normal-sized penises, and it can be fatal if ingested by basically turning your head into something that will explode if even just a little bit of pressure is put on it. And this is his exit strategy for his 23rd birthday. Quote, "Primed with medication, you prepare your body for its final passage, coiffing your hair and donning a clean-pressed shirt and jeans, anticipating death. The Spartans would spend hours grooming themselves before battle. Having failed in your quest, this is how you meet death. You roll up to the club and get the biggest, blackest, scariest motherfucker you can and walk right up to his face and call him the magic word. After death, he figures the coroner's response will be, quote, upon hearing about the specific circumstances of your demise, the coroner will shake his head, commenting that you probably spent too much time on the internet. The apparent cause of your destruction, impulsivity and overconfidence, manifested in a poor conceived act of trolling, the moniker of a purely digital realm bleeding into the consequences of meat space. Once he forces himself out of bed, he cleans up the cum that is dried to the floor from his nasty Kleenex pile and goes to a local coffee shop. The coffee shop, he argues, is a good thing. Quote, small establishments like these are the tip of the spear when it comes to gentrification. Concentrating the flow of Caucasian patronage is a crack and whiten the demographic composition of a neighborhood. By the straightforward logic of economic consequentialism, I'm arguing supporting a form of ethnic cleansing simply by drinking here. Yes, he is obviously very racially conscious, racist, and making a lot of decisions based on feelings of superiority. After a bit of aggression with some pink-haired, masculine eyebrowed barista, he continues on his way, mildly worried that the woman remembered him, but he didn't remember her. In the subway, he notices the diversity posters and has to stop himself from jumping in front of the train. At university, he complains about his professor being a diversity hire while he organizes a masturbation spreadsheet of undergrads and plays Tetris. He judges his classmates for throwing themselves at the teacher, and then he goes outside and eats lunch. Where he is sitting, he sees a bunch of bugs dismantling a lone baby bird, and it cries out. He stomps on it to put an end to its misery, and then says, "Let no one think he has no feelings." In the next class, he's watching a fight video when his classmate interrupts him to talk about how testosterone is a disease, but Anand believes, quote, there is a war on everything, at every conceivable layer of biology. Only weak men think that violence is ugly. It is, in fact, the purest thing that is. Later, he is at a ringside watching his friend, who is a Korean guy, fighting a black guy in the ring and thinking about how sex and fighting are fundamentally the same thing. Quote, "The fundamental driver behind the evolution of human intelligence is the primate capacity for mimicry. In observing the physical movements of another mammal, the brain's network of mirror neurons forms a virtualized representation of the same movement pattern within the semi-conscious boundaries of implicit procedural space. Although fighting and fucking are fundamentally distinct biological activities, the reason you love violence is the reason you love pornography. This process of observing and simulation, it has the effect of superimposing your body onto the body of the other, yielding the same dopamic reward as if that external body was in fact your very own. Thus, the tendency of all narrative forms is to evolve into a natural structure of power fantasy. When you imagine yourself as the man in the arena, you always win the most important fights and you always fuck the most important girls. Jason, the Korean, wins the fight, and Anand can't help but admire how Jason is the pinnacle of Korean perfection. He says that despite how peak Jason is, including with his tat that is kind of like a gang tattoo, they're friends because Jason is all-American and that's what they have in common. Afterwards, Anand does his own workout and checks for any messages on OkCupid. He has none. Go into Jason's backstory, where his parents came to America to create a better life, opened a store in a black neighborhood, got robbed. Dad was an old school rooftop Korean, so when threatened for money, he didn't hand it over. Dad was also a functional alcoholic, so in this interaction, he moved too slowly when he challenged the robber and got filled with lead. Jason's mom remarried a white guy who made him sit down and watch the security tape over and over and over again to help identify the killer. Also, Jason's stepdad beat him on the regular. Jason prefers to fight the black guys in the ring. Anand says that it's because of what happened to him. Anand also believes that you are who you are because of genetics, and people only make up what happens to you has any effect because it makes sense for humans to tell stories. Jason even has these results of a test pinned in his room saying that he has this warrior gene in him. Meanwhile, his social worker says that he acts the way he does because he comes from a broken home. Some weeks ago, Jason came over for drinking and some therapy talk after Anand's girlfriend, Elizabeth, broke up with him. Jason tells Anand that it was doomed from the start because anything that you need, anything that you must have, will always be taken away from you. So never get too attached, because the moment that you want it more is the moment that it's obviously not going to stick around. Thus, if you ever find yourself needing a woman, it's because you've already lost her. Fixation is the way to death. Fluidity is the way of life. Jason continues by telling Anand that he's hurting because he had an ideal in his head. It's not that his ex that he's hurting. It's not his ex that's hurting him. And he needs to get over it because she's already obviously moved on. Mourning something that's reached its natural limit was like mourning the end of the day. This leads Anand into thinking about the emails that Jason sends him at night, talking about why people can't understand each other because no one can truly understand the existence and experiences of others since existence is subjective. And we just have bubbles where similar things run into one another. But that last email is him saying that all psychology is fake. Don't listen to psychologists. And you'll have a couple of different people in the story that say that. Even his sister says that. Jason then says that when he was cleaning his house, he found a picture of his mom and stepdad together before dad was even dead. And so she probably cheated on him. And this turns into, quote, "A woman is no special thing, Anand. She's just like you and me, a temporary collection of elementary particles, a sack of meat covered with a bag of skin. Biologists have another word for this," he said. "Homo sapiens?" I said. "An animal," he said, "a base creature. No need to complicate things, Anand. Don't mistake nomenclature for knowledge." What? Why is it that only men are ever compared to animals? Why not women too? Is there any basis for such a distinction? Of course not. And so, the next question we must ask is, what is the definition of an animal? The Greeks understood this millennia ago. The primary characteristics of an animal is that it follows only instinct. It pained me, Anand. It truly pained me to listen to you babbling about your future together and the promises the two of you had made to one another, these childlike, toy-like things. Do not confuse her words for meaning. Against these instincts, all promises, all of the forever afters, no matter how sincere, all of it will turn to sand. She is faithful only to the power you represent, not to you. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it's not exactly making me feel better. I'm not finished yet. Have you ever heard of hypergamy? No. Animated, I can tell that my ignorance excites him. Imagine a great ladder extending from a deep, dark pit all the way up into the sky. Everything that you think you are, every interesting, supposedly unique thing about you, when a girl sizes you up, it's all decomposed into little particles of status. All she sees is a single rung on the ladder, a single rung among infinite others. Like a peg slotting into a hole, you're just an object that fits neatly into this massive, towering hierarchy. 3 billion men, all fixed onto the same ladder. Jason stretched his arm into the air, illustrating his argument before continuing. A woman's job in life is to climb the ladder as high as she can. To do this, she grabs onto the rungs and swings up to the next one and releases her grip on the first. This is her biological function, to climb and climb and climb, switching from one man to another whenever the right opportunity presents itself. Always, she wishes that she were higher, 1,000 feet in the air. It doesn't matter. There's still a little voice in her head telling her to keep moving upward. It's like greed or lust. Nature designed desire to be insatiable. No matter what, if she sees that opening above her, towering into the clouds, she's going to reach for it. Love, commitment, marriage, promises. They're all just words when measured against the screaming urgency of her underlying imperative, the unyielding, uncompromising need to keep going, to relieve a thirst that can never be quenched until the day that she is dead. And with that, Anon changes his major from whatever it was to evolutionary biology. Anon is then standing at the campus bus stop when the pinnacle of hotness arrives. Quote, after entering the central corridor of the shambolic steel carriage that constitutes our present mode of transportation, a guy grabs onto a hanging rubber strap and pops his head out of his hoodie, activating the eyes of a Latina 6 and a white 7 seated within his immediate radius. For a second, my surprise is a failed computation. The gear of recognition turned and stuttered, jagged movements, straining uncomfortably until their rotation is complete. It appears momentarily as if I'm staring at the profile of my own reflection. Viewed from the lateral angle, this resemblance quickly starts to loosen its fidelity to my own original, suggesting the appearance of a man who's situated a full point or two higher on the 10-point scale. Confirming my worst fears, he glances in my direction, revealing the whole of his face with the blithe, casual motion of a person who has never truly considered the inheritance of their own beauty. Lingering on the eerie, surreal isomorphism between me and my doppelganger, I examine the contours of his physiology in greater detail, lengthening a list of minor divergences that ramp up the racing of my heart with a more clearly delineated facial morphology. The scanning seems to fixate on the somewhat feminine embellishments of this particular phenotype. The bulbous fat of his lips plush with the blooming arrogance of youth, the almost oriental mystique of his eyes, frilled with coal-colored lashes that would look better on a woman, the overabundant excess of his blonde mane of hair, the strands of which slope down to the back of his head and curl out from the base of his hoodie, and twin Cheryl flourishes that rest upon the mounts of his shoulders in a semi-conscious attempt at Viking cosplay. That he is handsome hardly feels like a salient conclusion. If anything, the details of these divergences are minimally relevant for the purposes of mating. What matters, of course, is that anyone can tell that he probably has a very nice cock. Soon I am swarmed with the circling machinations of a secondary emotional response, a jealousy, no, a hatred that glows white-hot under the center of my chest, ruining the peace of an otherwise tolerable commute to the university. In the end, it's not the cumulative beauty of his attributes that sends me into an internal tailspin. It's the unmistakable postural confidence of a guy who fucks. He's constantly thinking about the assumed bedroom habits of other dudes. And more so, he's fixated on other dudes than women. This thought also leads him to curse that the founding fathers said all men are created equally, but looking at this Adonis compared to himself, that's not true at all. It's the luck of the gene wars. Then, Anon starts losing his mind over the fact that this 11 out of 10 hottie winner of the gene wars is a sellout, not a brother in arms, because he's listening to freaking hip-hop. Quote, there is a very particular tragedy in witnessing the crass degeneration of other young white men, who, under different circumstances, might well have been your comrades in some great struggle against Oriental despots in faraway exotic lands. The blonde beast as brothers in arms, once more, unto the breach, dear friends. Alas, this is now gone, obliterated by the absolute ignorance of your immediate forebears, a great legacy lost under the mass-produced heaps of artistic diatrists that have seized the youth of our era, materializing within the space of my own intentionality. There's a craving to grab him by the collar and seal the profanity of his lips with the claw of my hand, to pierce his mind and educate him on the sweeping majesty of Western civilization, of the hidden philosophy in the ruins of the Acropolis, of the magic power emanating from the Norse gods, of the simple elegance in Mendel's botanical genealogies, of the grand revelations in Darwin's finches, of the towering wisdom in our Declaration of Independence, of the sublime grandeur in Wagner's music, of the pristine Teutonic forms evident in Comte's paintings, of the interstellar probes who have sent to the furthest reaching corners of the galaxy. When he gets off the bus at school, he goes on to complain about how many Chinese people there are on campus and how much he doesn't like them. Quote, "Now, lest you be labeled an ignoramus on the subject of human anthropology, it is here that you must moderate certain tropes of East Asian sameness. Nature has determined that gooks come in gradations, and some are yellower than others. Relative to the Chinese, the Koreans are generally more considered and less obnoxious, possessing at least some measure of regard for the aesthetic hygiene of Anglo-Saxon cultural norms. Stifled by stunted growth and post-radioactive autism, the Japanese are even less perceptible in three-dimensional space, constitutionally meeker, smaller in stature, and lower in volume than any of their peer Mongoloids. But the Chinese, Christ, the Chinese, they're a special category of their own, a species of humans most easily distinguished by their utter shamelessness and total lack of concern for even the most mildest of civilizational mores. From a naturalist's perspective, their presence here feels deeply bizarre and ahistorical, as if an invasive species of shit-spewing geese has been dropped onto our continent by way of neo-biblical natural disasters, in a misguided attempt to produce an institution through a solely cognitive mediocrity. The college has failed to account for the potency of Confucian memorization and cultural-mandated test-taking preparations. Honed to exploit this flaw in pedagogical design, a sea of yellow faces pours out from the broken funnel of the students' admissions, Zerg rushing the campus with half the population of Beijing. The result is an overwhelming ethnic suffocation, a vast swarm of soulless STEM droids who lack the joie de vivre of genuine intellectual curiosity. Such is the final station of our social-cultural degeneration, of its endless worship of metrics, optimization, and key performance indicators. He follows this up by saying, quote, "For the average American male, life is but a nested series of indignities." If he told anyone about his thoughts, though, he knew that he would be called racist, but honestly, who cares, because the word means nothing nowadays anyway, since everyone and anything is racist, so it doesn't really matter. Quote, "To diffuse the power contained in any notional category of blasphemy, the seeker of truth must apply the rigor of a strict methodological discipline. The precise delineation of the word's conceptual boundaries is anything but autistic. Either it is correct or it is not, and correctness demands a formal operational definition legible in numerical perimeters." He thinks over a couple of studies that prove that no one really cares about other people, especially dead people of different races. The studies were about telling and showing people footage of deaths that happened in previous wars, and that there really wasn't much of an emotional response to hearing that information. Most people, when given a TV program showing the war deaths, would change the channel after about 30 seconds. So Anand defines everyone as being just as racist as anyone else, and the word or being labeled as that, or people throwing the label at you, is just a way of socially punting someone. One of the things that he is frustrated about with foreigners is that he just doesn't want them to be around anymore. He considers what they're doing to be sucking the knowledge off of the people who beat them and then going to try to conquer the white man in another way, since they had already been conquered physically. Quote, "In reaction, this spurs the autonomous emergence of a countervailing module, gestating an internal dialectic that percolates between cerebral hemispheres engaged in a self-generating conversational mode. One half of me clarifies that my intent is not genocidal. It's not like I want to kill these people. I'm not fucking brute. Nay, I am modern, the rightful inheritor of a genuine categorical imperative. Yes, a veritable gentleman, standing tall and purposeful among a gaggling horde of poorly civilized people. My humble singular ask is merely that I don't want so many of them here. Perhaps as a token moment, at most, ideally, just the women." When he enters the lab on campus, he is greeted by Andrew, and Anon is like, let's go off. I got some things to tell you about the project that I'm going to do. In the lab, Anon notates that Andrew actually includes him in things and also syncs up with him when they're walking. So this makes him actually like Andrew. But there are things that Anon likes much more than that. Quote, apart from his whiteness, my favorite thing about Andrew is in spite of his confidence and height, he is the most aggressively ugly in appearance, a borderline disabled physiology that acts as the central leveling agent in our relationship. By way of third-party accounts from peers, it's been reported that he also has an enormous penis. My personal theory is that the growing organ likely parasitizes nutrients meant for the face in utero, granting him phallic supremacy in exchange for the deformation of his facial characteristics. This is the foundation of our friendship, the very thing that makes it possible. Oh, Andrew, you might definitely need to get a better friend. Anon takes Andrew to a basement room with videotapes, and he puts the first one in, which is a woman with wires up in her genitals watching chimps have sex. It was apparently an experiment to measure female arousal done by an old French guy who recently was fired from the university for being racist on Twitter. He put on another videotape that's a man and a woman having sex, the same woman watching and being monitored, and then there's a control tape, which was a non-sexual scene from Fight Club with Brad Pitt talking to Helena Bonham. It didn't really work as a control tape, though, because the woman still got aroused when watching it. Anon then explains why the woman was getting turned on by Brad Pitt, and it had to do with the combination of celebrity status plus the best, most confident take of the shot in the movie. Quote, my hypothesis is that the woman is not just reacting to the actor's physical appearance alone. She is reacting to the social status of Tyler Durden, to some combination of factors that are completely independent of his physical appearance, something that boomers call charm, something that the internet subculture calls game. I got a feeling that Anon might be a little bit more attracted to Tyler Durden specifically than the woman on the screen with, the level of obsession, but I digress. Quote, since the dawn of psychology, many tomes have been written on Freud's final question, why do women fuck? In a sense, our entire field is an attempt to answer this single question, but we've always struggled against bureaucratic strictures, against their lack of methodological imagination. What we have here is the equivalent of a completely new paradigm of study, in effect, a Skinner box applied to female human sexuality. It's reductive, yes, but so is every good experimental design. That's just how we listen to nature's chorus. Stimulus, response. With some adjustment, it could be transposed from the gutter of sexology and into the noble field of evolutionary psychology, elevating both of our careers in the process. You and I both know how gravely limited the tools of our discipline really are. We are well acquainted with the absolute poverty of undergraduate surveys, of social desirability biases, of too many layers of abstraction between experiment constraints and ground-level truth. Now, you see, this question is important to ask about female human sexuality because the mechanisms of female desire are substantially more complex than male desire, and Anon doesn't want to die a virgin. Quote, we know that female desire is probably predicated on some kind of multi-dimensional model of mate selection, a linear checkpoint-gated pathway that screens potential partners through a stepwise sorting mechanism. Such a system would be oriented around serial barriers of disqualification in which discrete modules act as individual checkpoints, pragmatically assessing different dimensions of mate value in a stepwise fashion. For example, the first checkpoint is to establish some minimum threshold in the male genetic quality based on a combination of body symmetry, masculinity, and overall morphology. We might call this the looks threshold, even though postural confidence also probably plays a role. Following that, additional modules stipulate further dimensions of evaluation. To achieve coitus, one must greenlight through each of these subsequent checkpoints until the final level. Given this structural complexity, we need a tool for analytical simplification to distill the output into a single variable that feeds back to the experimenter's insight. The bro is mega overcomplicating just, being charming, talking to somebody, but that's because he's seeking an absolute control and zero failure rate when talking to women. Quote, With intersexual relations, the data is more anecdotal, more noisy, gritty. It feels dirty, like something cladistically derived from tactics deployed by used car salesmen lacking a scientific rigor. It's just a bunch of retards posing contradictory advice on dating forums. But in principle, insofar as every mapping implies an optimal route of action, there must be a potential pathway for the codification of courtship techniques. Classically, solving this has been an intractable problem. Whenever a guy finds himself hitting on a girl, he always complains about not knowing what to say. But insofar as language is infinitely generated, predicting conversational pathways appears to be a classic combinational explosion. That unbound complexity isn't real, though. It's imagined. Underlying the nominal semantic content of any such exchange, there's an underlying pattern that remains consistent across encounters. It's not that there isn't a map of these underlying finite possibilities, it's just that we don't know it yet. He adds a business proposal to all of this, quote, "Now, I'm on the outset of my career. I'm a man of science, right, but maybe 10, 20 years from now, when the amount of hardware compute finally gets there, you and I could potentially even commercialize this data set, maybe train an artificial intelligence on it, create a system of wireless connected contact lenses, or perhaps smart glasses with built-in microphones, cameras, and a headset display, marketing it as the kind of social prosthesis that provides real-time social feedback to the user. Imagine the value proposition of being able to instantly decode subtle micro-expressions into the actionable indicator of interest. Think of it, a tool to algorithmically optimize your projection of status. As with any type of arms race, there's a chance that it could even become functionally mandatory to compete in the sexual marketplace, like some kind of next-generation anabolic steroid that sets the physical standards of male physique in some future generation of descendants. Arguably, this type of human enhancement is already happening. There was a study that showed that Tylenol can diffuse the negative impact of social rejection. I've actually seen a forum post about some guys taking it before they hit up the club. Doesn't seem to work that well, though. Now, I do have a solution for you, my guy. It's from Japan. It's this gray oblong pill, quantum nanotechnology CPU. The quantum computer in the pill will travel through your blood until it enhances your brain and it tells you what to do. It tells you what to do. It's pre-programmed. It's amazing. Speaks to you directly. You behave as it's appraising. Helps you act correctly. It helps you to be cool. It helps you rule. Bruh, it's the squip. It's here. It's here. Bro would eat this squip up like that. Andrew thinks on this proposal, and we get this description of Anand going over and above with wanting his ego stroked. I had to share this. Quote, "Soon my excitement reaches a crescendo, escalating into a charged, excitatory configuration. I imagine in precise anatomical detail my intellect as an astral projection emanating from an apex of my forehead, the firmly erect phallus of an ego that extends from the top of my dome like the alien antenna of a green Teletubby transported from a network television. Intellectually aroused, Andrew reaches across and grabs the swollen shaft of my throbbing, fully erect ego-intellectual Teletubby head penis, squeezing and stroking the length of my swollen member with the concentric vigor of an unconventional affirmation, showering his face in thick ropes of glowing astral cum." Unfortunately, Andrew does not like this idea, so he will not be stroking the aforementioned ego-intellectual Teletubby head penis, and actually doesn't understand how Anon even thinks any of this is possible. Quote, "This idea needs to die in this basement," he says. "I can guarantee you that." "But what if it works?" I say. "If anybody was crazy enough to actually try this, not only would they get destroyed by REB, they'd probably get hauled in front of some kind of human rights commission that built exclusively to punish people crazy enough to be involved." A ratchet dials in the center of my throat. I study his face, and he studies mine. "That's it? You don't have anything good to say about this?" I say. "All I can tell you is that this is the most autistic fucking thing I've ever heard in my entire life." He says, "Dude, I'm not autistic. Okay, because you're clearly not following, I'm going to make it even simpler for you. Vaginal wetness, blood flow, and erection, whatever, it's not a fucking light switching on. Physiology alone isn't incontrovertible evidence of sexual desire. There's a lab down the hall where they're writing a paper on vaginal wetness as the evolved reflex, a biological mechanism built to avoid life-threatening infections associated with genital tearing from rape. You can't reduce sexuality to a single parameter. Not only is it dehumanizing, it's dangerous. There's no empirical substitute for talking to human beings and asking them how they feel. Moisture isn't the same thing as consent. He gestures around the room. Plus, there's a reason nobody does this shit anymore. It's creepy as fuck. Anon fixates on the word creepy and being called creepy by his friend, or who he thought was his friend, Andrew, and it hurts him. Andrew tells him that if he wants to get laid, then he needs to treat people like human beings. It's not that hard. After that, Andrew leaves. Anon puts the tapes away while thinking about his new direction of study because of Andrew's mention of rape. How to trigger function in the prefrontal cortex to get consent scientifically. Anon is excited about his future prospects and believes that Darwin would be proud of him. Skip forward and he's listening to some 5 out of 10 girl talking. He says that she is not hot enough to demand his full attention, but also, quote, in spite of her problematic lack of hotness, I nonetheless find myself having a good time. He found this girl at an anime sale and he comes here for a purpose. Quote, the store sells niche cultural products from the East Asian vassal state of the periphery of American imperialism and is rather conveniently having a sale on a variety of anime and manga titles at the steep discount relative to historical prices. Although I'm holding a small bag containing a DVD case of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, my attempt at shopping was purely instrumental. Consumerism is not the present purpose behind my current location. I am here because the sale happens to draw a non-trivial number of semi-attractive white girls who for whatever reason are into this sort of obscure foreign garbage and are therefore more likely to fall within the attainable range of attractiveness while still existing within a relatively narrow band of fuckable range. The girl that he is talking to is getting some bad vibes. Anon says that it's her feeling the loneliness that dissipates from his pores, and that's something that the female race is just attuned to. He daydreams about his ex and keeps thinking about her until a girl from the anime shop says that it's time to go. He mentally clocks her as being entirely disappointing physically. Quote, displacing the brunt of my focus back into her eyes, she waits for me to confirm the end of our conversation. She's got a short ponytail and a yellow corduroy sweater that suggests her background in design or some art-adjacent field. This is not an accident. From the literature, you'll find that women with tattoos and other creative types tend to have more sexual partners. Underneath the sweater, her breasts appear as underwhelming feature emblematic of an unremarkable overall physique, a pair of half-assed pancake-shaped attachments that have long forgotten about golden ratios or even the simple act of trying. Built like a Pringles can, alloyed with a decidedly Nordic sturdiness, the comparison is impossible to avoid. She doesn't hold a candle to Elizabeth's pristine waist-to-hip ratio, but she is not entirely without worth. Rather, her value is limited to a reproductive rather than a dopamageric dimension. In an earlier era, she might have taken the respectable role of a Viking shield maiden bearing athletic, sturdy sons of a warrior's constitution. Buttressed by a stolid respect of her utilitarian Scandinavian desirability, her rejection produces no negative emotions whatsoever. He takes a break from talking to girls and whatever this research is to go and sit down with a coffee. He complains about the disgusting look of this store, the signs, the visual overload of the inferior Oriental futurism compared to genuine European architecture. He says the place is soulless, without characters, but worst of all, nobody here wants to sleep with him. So he leaves. He judges where he is walking as a joke. America chews men up and spits them out. A first world shitting in a pothole, he says. He runs into a pretty girl at the bus stop who makes him nervous. It seems like he didn't really talk to her, as the next thing you know, he's waking up laying in bed for a while and then preparing himself for the next day. Meditating, imagining himself as an apex predator killing a lion with a spear as he listens to the unbridled sexual energy of Phil Collins in the air tonight, on his music player. Now he spots a 6 out of 10 girl going into Pottery Barn. He tries to talk to her, but she immediately rejects him, and he writes this in his notebook before walking up to another girl who is reading a magazine. He tries to talk to her, calling her cute and saying that's why he wanted to talk to her. She saw him talking to the other girl and was like, okay, how often do you run this scam? Anon panics that he has been caught doing field research and leaves the store before writing down that he was rejected a second time in Pottery Barn. He opens by saying, our brains remember our failures as a survival instinct, as our bodies don't want us to fail or go through that pain again. He's smoking with his sister, thinking about sex and how the more you tend toward ugliness, the more you tend away from what's natural. His sister recognizes that he's feeling off, says that he should talk to someone about it. He rejects the advice and demands actual good advice. She says, stop being a cunt to everyone. Momentarily, he thinks about pushing her over the edge of the building. The moment is interrupted when she gets a notification for a new music video posting. Quote, what happens next defies computation. My sister, a 24-year-old heterosexual white woman living in modern America, appears utterly captivated by the overproduced choreography puppeteered into feminized bodies of Asian quasi-males biomedically engineered for their neotenous valley between adolescent and adulthood. Hypnotized by the proprietary combination of oriental synchronicity and easily legible melodies, her eyes mutate into childlike and jovial configurations, suggesting a total dopaminergic enslavement. For me, it's an audiovisual assault that borders on unbearable and an unholy hybridization of saccharine synthetic tones and a second-rate autotune run through a meat grinder of gobbledygook speak that sounds like a ground glass sliding down an electrical chalkboard. They argue because ARX-Han doesn't believe that women could actually find androgynous or feminine men attractive. She mentions that there is a history of very attractive androgynous men. ARX-Han says he's just in complete disbelief that was ever real. ARX-Han tells Rachel that she spends too much time on the internet, and she says, I could say the same to you. Silence follows. He determines that there is no purpose to keep on talking to her, and that he can't tell her his true feelings, which includes his belief that Asian penis is too small for a white woman. However, white man and Asian woman pairing works since the sexual dimorphism isn't going to be an issue, according to him. Sister then says that she has a new boyfriend named Juan. ARX-Han is feeling suicidal at hearing this and tries to astral project himself away from his feelings, but he can't. While seeing Jason make out with some brunette at a bar and the blonde girlfriend is trying to pull her off while yelling racial slurs, this leads ARX-Han to thinking about what is, psychologically speaking, a slur. He has a theory. Quote, it is simultaneously an incantation, something that draws upon the spirits of the past, nothing less than the power of your ancestors opposed against the weakness of theirs, an ancient pyramid built on the bones of conquered dead. Although this explanation reeks of occult magic, its mechanisms are strictly material. In the last 100-odd years, every apex mongoloid has been crushed or conquered by Anglo-American Caucasoids. And with every great victory comes the birth of a novel slur. The Chinese in the year of 1900, the Japanese in 1940s, and the Koreans in the 1950s. One might argue that Jason is technically a gook and not a chink, but the distinction hardly matters to the broad phenotypical categorization of the unconscious. Across overlapping seasons of time, these triumphs dominantly survive as psychological rather than historical events, a temporal transmission perpetuated by the intergenerational reproduction of a natural racial hierarchy that has stably held for hundreds of years. Like water flowing to the lowest point, foundational patterns emerge in places both obvious and surprising, sprouting in the mouths of contemporary Americans or in curious, otherwise inexplicable acts of self-ignoration among the Asiatic transplants who have migrated to the continent that annihilated their forebears. He also announces that Jason lied about having 2 babies already when he was 18 in order to get a vasectomy so he couldn't get anyone else pregnant. And ARX-Han says that Jason's inability to have kids is also what makes their friendship work. He also says that Jason being a lower IQ than him makes their friendship possible. Jason gets raunchy about wanting to do the brunette's friend, and the girl gets mad. He anticipates a drink being thrown and dodges it so that it hits the girl instead. The 2 women storm off, and Jason doesn't have any friends aside from ARX-Han, and that's because he's a misanthropic sex pest. ARX-Han's description. Jason says that he's pretty content with how things are and he's not going to seek anything further in a relationship, and he also doesn't have any career goals. He's happy fighting, having sex, and being high while working at this bar. ARX-Han asks for feedback on his paper. I'm assuming it's a sex paper based on what he was showing Andrew, and he gets kind of offended/defensive at Jason's criticisms. Jason refuses a job of doing papers for some lazy student because he doesn't need the money, and then excuses himself to go outside. This is a job that was offered to him by Anon, saying some kids that I know want to hire you to do a paper because they don't want to do it themselves. Shortly after, Anon goes looking for him because it's shift change time, and Jason is in a back alley beating a couple of white dudes, and Anon thinks that Jason looks so cool, like a samurai. In the next segment, Anon starts going on about how pair bonding and attraction is an automatic process of humans, so cheating isn't really a big deal. It's just your biology doing what it's supposed to do. And then he says he is in the ER with Jason. When they go back to get him fixed up, Anon is judging everyone that they pass. The nurse is a hot Vietnamese woman. Jason doesn't want to do the treatment option and mostly has Anon look over him as he rests. And while doing that, he complains about not having better, whiter friends that could help him get higher on the social ladder and sleeping with women. But the fact is that they are both kind of losers, and that's why they're friends. He continues going around collecting information on how to talk to women by talking to women and failing, and trying different things like smiling and mimicking Joseph Gordon-Levitt from 500 Days of Summer. He starts talking to this one girl, and it's going really well, systematically going through the information to give her and keeping things to himself that he's like, I probably shouldn't say that. He does get the girl's number and leaves feeling confident. Quote, my brain recognizes this as the scent of opportunity. The street is a veritable parade of walking vaginas. Anon is on a date with this girl named Emily, and it's going well. Quote, Emily laughs at my joke about Mexicans, but there's something strange about the way that her voice clangs throughout the bar. After a bit of processing, I realize that it's because her response lacks sincerity. She is only laughing because she wants something. The observation means two things. One, that she doesn't share my mildly derogative views of Mexicans, or two, that she is willing to suppress her actual political sentiments as a means of currying my favor. The corollary of these 2 points is a fact singular in its clarity. By dint of Occam's razor, the most likely thing that she wants is for my penis to be inside of her vagina. So it's going well. He's disassociating while talking to her and trying to avoid killing himself out of sheer boredom because he just doesn't care. He believes that she thinks that she can do better, which is fine by him because he thinks that he can also do better than her. He says the best attribute about her is that she is white. He's not without the graces of understanding, though. Quote, as I watch her carefully presenting an image of confidence, I impute a degree of insecurity behind the fidgeting of her foot near the edge of the table. This produces something in the way of empathy, and I understand her as the entity facing her own set of gendered difficulties. For men, self-esteem is partially dislocated from the sole dimension of one's appearance. Thus, it's a comparatively more pliable metric, eminently amenable to the affirmative techniques of psychological programming. Indeed, many such tools are available to the persons open to the full spectrum of creative possibilities. You could, for instance, take cock in hand and slow jerk to your naked reflection in front of the mirrors as you mouth the 14 words on repeat, submerging yourself in the image of your lats undulating with the back and forth motion of your fingers curled along the cylinder of your shaft. Meanwhile, he's trying to peek at her breasts and determined that he's watched too much porn to get hard from regular women and that there's no way that he could have sex with her because she's not hot enough to give him a rise. He eventually invites her up to his flat where she says no. She thought that they were going to go and drink somewhere else. This more or less leads to the end of the date because she knows that he wants sex and she is not down for it. So he goes upstairs, masturbates, and thinks about Emily's sad face, realizing that they're just animals existing to have sex, and he saw no meaning behind her but a hole. And he thinks, quote, escape from this system of relation is an impossibility, for I too am disposable in the regards. The arms and legs of my body a mere system of locomotion to support the primacy of the penis. I too am oppressed by the unyielding regime of phallocentric feudalism, a system that provides a penile peasants with no potential recourse in the open market of modern society. Even with the injection of supraphysiological doses of ZRP-059 into the shaft of my flaccid meat stick, no growth occurs. The drug is useful for one thing only, for ingestion and intracranial absorption, for priming my head to explode upon contact. Thus, she and I are both victims of biology, myself of the capricious polygenic lottery plus or minus intrauterine xenoestrogen exposure, and she of the Grayland sensitivity index optimally calibrated for the intermittent starvation of a hunter-gatherer environment. He also thinks about how evolution exists to create more pain. This is all in his imagination as he imagines teaching Emily the truth about the universe and evolution and existence. He explains to Emily, quote, beautiful people are are exempt from suffering. You and I are not. Anyone under a 7 out of 10, whether male or female, falls below the threshold of true personhood. You are not here to reproduce your genes. You are here to reproduce your pain. Then an eel comes out of her mouth, wraps around him. He wakes up and he sees an unsent email for his ex and he cries. He's later at Starbucks and he sees this really hot woman, immediately imagines himself having sex with her. Then he is talking to his sister who thinks that he doesn't have enough empathy while they gossip over a woman who used to be beaten by her husband. He offends his sister by insulting K-pop again, and then he decides that his sister is no longer a real person but an NPC as she goes on about systematic racism. He says that she is a shell of her former self, and he just is not going to talk on the subject with her anymore so that he can maintain a sibling relationship with this empty shell of the person who won't make racist jokes with him anymore. Then he zones out as his sister lectures him. The next chapter starts out with a major brain bomb of groovy brain. Quote, "In my experience, the hardest thing about living isn't the really bad shit that happens to you. It's the shit that doesn't happen. That's what fatigue is, a lack, something that should really be present but ultimately is not. Fatigue isn't something our culture really talks about, maybe because most people are tired all the time, but there's a particular type of exhaustion that comes from the prolonged absence of penetrative vaginal intercourse, a progressive load that presses on the structure of your psyche until the walls of reason start to buck from within. Here you are the most vulnerable, because when you are near the limit of the load-bearing capacity, any potential reprieve immediately achieves an outsized level of symbolic significance, an involuntary projection into the future that rapidly spirals into the realm of uncontrollable fantasy." He talks to a girl named Zoe, who he grades as inexperienced and an 8 out of 10. He talks about the psychology of going for an inexperienced girl. Quote, "While the meta strategy of pursuing partners with minimal sexual experience might be construed as a maladaptive expression of inadequate self-esteem, it's a natural impulse held by every man afflicted with the positional insecurity of a below average mate value. Among the population of males, there is an immense desire, however statistically unlikely, to find a partner who still has a chance of being impressed by his attributes. This need extends to every conceivable dimension where he might be judged favorably or unfavorably, concentrating on the troughs of his deepest fragility. It has, for example, occurred to many that the male penis is an anatomical organ that is primarily judged by way of comparison. The smaller the N of the sample, the smaller the size of the median penile referent and the bigger yours. In Psychology 101, it is referred to as the sampling bias." Then he makes up a reason to ditch the girl he's talking to go and have a chicken nugget break. He's excited about meeting up with her at some point for alcohol and possibly sex, which gets him thinking about how excitement like this is actually antithetical to hooking up, because it's a non-aphrodisiac on girls if you're excited to see them. Also has him thinking about how Jason says the more excited you are to see a girl, the less likely she is to return your feelings because you are mismatched in the sexual marketplace and she is above you. He is not paying attention in class and instead is browsing Reddit when he gets into a couple of fights, which is one of his favorite pastimes and also the way that he copes a lot. In between cursory contributions and the group's ongoing dialogue, someone on Reddit accuses me of stealing the entirety of my Prometheus model from a duo of British YouTubers selling video instructionals on pay-to-view websites. I correct his understanding of thievery, clarifying that originality is but a myth of folk psychology, that we are mere set of particles bound by the same causal chain as all others. That man is but a vector from the past reaching forward through time. Indeed, he is but a conduit. There is nothing in him that is or ever could be original. Satisfied with the cleverness of my response, I refreshed the page about a dozen times until it accumulates 5 upvotes. Dude is probably also an AI bro, let's be real. That is AI bro argumentation right there. He gets into more Reddit fights before closing the computer to pay attention to class because the teacher is staring at him. Then there's a mention of theory that has to do with pair bonding and hypergamy again. Mark, Anon's least favorite fat neckbeard, butts into the conversation to call the work problematic. Mark and Anon argue back and forth about how likely women are to cheat and that it's biological for women to cheat, even if the data doesn't show it. When the argument ends, he Facebook stalks his ex-girlfriend and daydreams about her with her new boyfriend, gets upset, and thinks about how he is just an average American male and no one gives a crap about him. We're at a brief Fight Club thing going on and feeling connection to other men who are fighting. Now, we flash back to him being beaten up by some kid when he was younger. They pull his pants down and beat him with a stick. The bully also tries to sodomize him with the stick, and he continues to taunt him. He disassociates momentarily to think about the multiverses existing where he could live a better life than the one that he's got. During the fight when he was 13 is when he met Jason, who jumped into the fight to help Anon beat the bullies, not because he liked Anon, but because it didn't seem fair for the group to gang up on the one kid. And at the end of the fight, Anon gouges out the bully's eyes. Returning to the Fight Club moment of current time, Anon has lost the fight and he hates himself for it. The ninth girl that he is talking to today actually looks at him like she is interested in him as a person, and he says, quote, "Personhood is a thing that you cannot find in yourself. It is only reflected in the eyes of others." It's an astute statement on a personal value of how he sees himself and where he gets his own value from. It only comes from others for him, and he thinks that she is really pretty and the conversation is going well. He thinks that she is down to be with him. She mentions being in the track team, and he immediately assumes that she has had sex with more than one person who is also on the varsity team. And then Anon makes himself nervous about that, quote, setting an impossible sexual standard for comparison. Things seem a little bit iffy, but he recovers her graces. He recognizes that they haven't exchanged names yet, but it doesn't really matter. They don't need names for the sort of thing that he's looking for. Although we have not yet exchanged names, this kind of nomenclature is no longer relevant for our purposes. The importance of formalism is always overestimated by the male brain. What matters not is a list of your objectively valuable characteristics. What matters are her feelings and the men who can deliver them. The conversation with her continues to go well. He starts daydreaming about their possible future relationship while she's talking. He stops himself from doing this by thinking about her pooping in great detail. She says that she has to go and they exchange phone numbers. Quote, "I reach the next block and I have to restrain myself from echoing these apparitions and borderline psychosis of a public jovial display. Several hours later, I spend a good hour crafting the perfect message for sneakers, firing off a perfectly calibrated text that expertly balances an appreciation for her unique characteristics with the clear subtext of my superabundant options in the marketplace of fleshy orifices." She doesn't reply. So now he feels like killing himself again. He's hearing his neighbors bang next door, and he gets up to go to his computer and go through his favorite bookmarks to ease the pain. Quote, "What I like most about the internet, well, what everyone likes about the internet, I suppose, is knowing that you are not alone in your suffering. Insofar as the anonymity of a forum displays the hidden qualia of otherwise atomized individuals in a centralized pool, it lies in the honest ability to capture a median primate's daily existence on an orbital hellscape. Only when you peel away the flesh of a man's face can you directly examine the contents of his consciousness, opening an unobscured channel past the myriad filters of social calibration that constrain the public exhibition of his existential distress. Mental states are like resonant frequencies. They seek coherence and amplification from like-minded peers. Thus, the cure for loneliness is the plug into the lives of others. Through the reciprocal interface of voyeurism and exhibitionism, you can relegate yourself to a single node among the collective of otherwise isolated individuals. This amounts to a networked vampirism, a sucking of energy from the lost, disaffected souls who spend days immortalizing their grievances onto the marks of a digital ledger. Perhaps the enlightened primate understands that the transcendence emerges from the descent into the void, not the ascent into Valhalla. He spends most of the night masturbating and going through so many different threads, like 2 pages worth of threads ranging from politics to INCEL and women and random things related to life and conspiracy theories. He is then on Reddit being mocked by a few users for his post about wishing that he went back in time at a better time where he could live in an ethno-state. He almost loses his temper and prematurely replies, but comes back later to DM the one guy that really irritated him and harass him the rest of the night in DMs, eventually trying to log his IP with a link in the DMs, but the guy doesn't open that, doesn't click the link. He skips class the next day because he didn't sleep at all last night. Jason shows up at Anon's house to take him out for tacos and drinking. The dude is so high. As he sits there, he talks about how life is meaningless because everything is random and you can't get meaning from random. As Anon tries to talk to him, it turns out that Jason's mom killed herself. He blames stepdad and says that he almost killed his stepdad right then and there too. but he just got out, so he just scrammed. Has it ever occurred to you that every single point in history, one or more of your ancestors was alive? He says. Yes, I say. We too are a sort of history. A man is the lineage of every decision that he has ever made, both good and bad. Do you understand this, Anon? Jason announces that he's going to be taking a trip to Korea so that he can go to an island to pour out his mother's ashes as she requested. Both he and Anon agree that they both have always hated living in the United States. Anon is later at an office with his professor making a thesis proposal, something to do with ethnobiology and evolutionism. The two of them argue about the legitimacy of his choice study, while the teacher ultimately does agree to approve the study, though the teacher believes that humans are no better than other animals on the planet, and Anon argues that humans are superior to other living beings. When the teacher has had enough, he leaves, and it seems that Anon faints. Anon is on his way now to a girl's apartment. She's a 6.5 or something. He's so nervous about this. It's the first time he has been in this situation where he is being invited up to a girl's house. He's thinking how nervous he is, quote, ready to be evacuated at a moment's notice. A log of shit turtles in and out of the rim of my tightened sphincter, teasing a whole log defecation. From this book to my eyes to your ears. I got you, fam. The girl gets him in the room and all is going well. She is eager to go down on him, to get down, has got him on the couch. He's got the desire to hide his erection and also wants to pull it out. As they undress, quote, triumphantly staring at the modest dimensions of my erect penis, she stands over the carpeted floor, towering over me like an Amazonian soldier ready for conquest. In the pit of my stomach, the immensity of the task at hand overtakes my resolve, threatening me with the industrial-grade clitoris framed by thick, powerful quads. The potent vigor of a warrior princess ready to get properly fucked. She puts a condom on him and prepares to go down on him when he goes soft. My dick shrinks even further, wrinkling the shaft of the condom like a dehydrated synthetic worm. She stares. He is reading her disappointment. Quote, stripped of its temporal dimension, the status hierarchy is fixed as follows. Anon, 0, no less than 0. A total fucking non-entity. Creatures unworthy of consuming oxygen, a wretched, disgusting aberration unbecoming of nature's grand design. Forced to consciously modulate the pace of my breathing to suppress an instinctive drive toward hyperventilation, it's at this exact moment that the thought slams into me face first. This is what it's like to be wiped out of the gene pool. So, she says. She gets him some water and puts on the movie Drive, since they're obviously not having sex. He finally leaves when things are beyond uncomfortable and runs home wanting to die and believing that he deserves to die as a weakling, because he is a weakling. He sort of zones out and then dreams into something that turns real, that's what he calls it. This peak of a man is there and they're fighting each other. A voice inside him tells him to get up, and that's when he realizes that he no longer wants to die. He fights this guy in the bar and eventually beats him and gets the bartender on his side by saying that guy is part of the Aryan Brotherhood while pointing to some random tattoos. The bartender appreciates Anon, and Anon goes outside to cool down and realizes that he has pooped himself while fighting the guy. There is this redhead who is pretty attractive who has come out after seeing the fight, and she says hi. He is then sitting with his sister again, where she tells him, quote, the other day I was shopping for a shirt downtown and I saw some random guy talking to a woman. It looked like the same kind of awkward forced conversation that you see so often at bars or nightclubs, but weirdly happening in H&M. I noticed right off the bat that she desperately wanted out of the conversation but just couldn't seem to get away from the guy. What most men don't understand is that this kind of uninvited attention falls somewhere along the continuum of coercion. Aside from the very real possibility of violence from a total stranger off the street, she was also trapped by the overbearing social pressure coming at her from the completely random person who felt entitled to fuck up the middle of her day. And it made me angry. Here's this girl just trying to go about her business, and some random asshole feels 100% entitled to her time, 100% entitled to taking up her space, to inflict his preferences on her. This dolt of a man who is either incapable of reading her distinct disinterest or worse, just totally indifferent to them. And so, like any other responsible member of society, I decided that I was going to step in and help her out. One of her hands curled into a fist, cupping into the other. And then I took another step in her direction, she says. Her voice sort of cracks, then hardens. And I realized it was you. She tells him that psychology is bunk, and not only clings to evolutionary psychology so that he can put computer science programming on human behavior like it would actually help him crack a code and control things. But you can't do that. You can't treat people like objects. She encourages him to go out and meet people in ways that other people meet, but he is clearly depressed. Quote, "The thing that you have to understand about evolution, dear sister, is that it doesn't give a fuck about someone like me." She laughs. "That not this nonsense again," she says. "What?" I say. "You cannot be serious about this. Nobody actually thinks about this stuff in real life. That's because human beings need to live in a constant state of delusion to prevent them from killing themselves. Please, psychology isn't even a real science. I'm not interested in having this debate with you. I don't want you to debate with me. I want you to listen to me. I've been listening to you virtually uninterrupted for nearly 30 minutes. Rachel rests her hands on my shoulders. "What I'm saying is that you need to see things from the other side," she says. "That strikes me as a roundabout way of you saying that I hate women," I say. "I know you hate women, but I think I'm probably more concerned with you hating yourself. I don't hate women. The thing about smart people is that they can be just as rigid as stupid people. They just do it with more complex rationalizations. You don't know anything about my life," I say. "Help me understand then. I'm listening. You're a girl, Rachel. All you have to do in life is show up and get fucked." I step back from her this time, and she begins her retreat. "You got a real way with words, you know that?" she says. "You haven't refuted any of my beliefs," I say. One last glance, and she pauses mid-stride. "Anon, your life is a refutation of your beliefs." Then Rachel walks away. What a burn. What a burn. And he still thinks that the way that he lives, the way that he thinks, is the way to live. Anon is then texted by the redhead from the bar and decides not to kill himself this morning. He's on the date with the redhead, talking to her, and things are going well. He goes to the bathroom to give himself a Viagra to make sure that it stays up this time if he goes back to an apartment with her. But he feels like the pill will devalue this into just a biological function, so he flushes it, goes back out there, and things are still going well. Quote, "In the silence, you trade glances. From across the table, Chloe gives you the look that more or less tells you how the night's going to end. It's such a simple, basic thing that you've always wanted. And then the day arrives, and then it's here, waiting for you like it's been there all along. And then it's done." He wakes up the next day in his bed and feels like he is the same, and he is still depressed. It is amazing that the sex did not change his life. Now we go over what happened with the redhead, where she helped Anon even though he went soft during their time together. He finished within 60 seconds, and she hid her disappointment in general, encouraging him, complimenting him. He's at home trying to vomit it into the toilet because that's what he does when he wants to cry, since he can't actually cry, and vomiting makes him cry. He's thinking about the meaning of life, himself, what he wants, what he's doing, what other people are, and quote, his ex, and quote, "Here then your language fails you. How else to describe it then? What is the miracle of consciousness if not a soul? Incredibly, this divinity extends even to you, transmuting your putrid desire into something greater than the torrid selfishness of your erect penis." His interior thought about all of this is a lot more than that. It goes on for a couple of pages as he works through to get to this conclusion that there is something deeper in life. Then he finally vomits. Then he goes outside of his apartment, sees the neighbor, thinks about how she's a cheating wife and who she is cheating with, and thinks, quote, "It's nothing to them. Love. It's absolutely nothing." So he's judging her based on his assumption that she's cheating. We'll come back to her in a little bit. Just put a pin in that for like a page. Anon is then at a therapist's office, and he's angry. He wants to destroy everything, seething with anger because he had sex. It's still meaningless. He's still depressed. His life is not changed. He doesn't understand the meaning, and everybody is just depressing, okay? The therapist says that it's not good to hold on to this anger, and they're going back and forth with lots of tension, though the therapist is keeping a very cool head about it, and Anon checks out, quote, "It would save both of us a lot of trouble if we could agree that I don't have any real diagnosis. My only diagnosis, my incurable, wholly intractable condition, is that I cannot help but see the world as it is, not how I want it to be." The therapist tells a story about how he saw monks wearing masks to make sure that they didn't accidentally eat bugs when they were walking, and they used brooms to move the bugs out of the way from the ground so they didn't accidentally kill those bugs by stepping on them. He says personally he is a vegetarian to minimize the harm that he does, but he at one point drew the lines at bugs until he read a study that said that bugs could feel pain. So now he goes out of his way into the world to try to minimize pain. Anon says that is freaking stupid, and then he leaves, sending his sister an invoice for the therapy to prove that he actually went to therapy, to see if it'll make his sister talk to him again, because ever since he said what he said to her about women just show up to get fucked and that's their entire purpose in life, she hasn't talked to him. Now he is standing on a dock and it's all quiet. His sister has not responded to his text, and he thinks about women via how perfect he thought Elizabeth was. Quote, on the internet, it is said that all women are the same. While our fungibility as human beings may well be fact of biology, no man binds to the universal, only the particular. He then deletes the photo of his ex that was still on his phone. He keeps looking at the water, thinking of how its movement represents the way that will eventually destroy and overtake humans. He has a letter for his sister apologizing for what he said, but he drops it into the water and lets it be destroyed. Today is his 23rd birthday. He's surprised that he's still alive. He doesn't feel like himself. As this chapter gets started, it's done mostly in second person as the character disassociates from himself, not feeling like he is in his own body, but an automaton. He watches some YouTube lectures about cleaning his room to go to get your life in order, and then he starts doing just that. He finds something that belonged to his neighbor, Thomas, the man who is supposedly being cheated on by his wife. Thomas is also the man that helped him move in initially when he got to this apartment. He goes to the neighbor's house knowing full well that Thomas is not going to be there because Thomas will be at his work job. So he's going to have to talk, knowing that Thomas is going to be at his job. So he's going to have to talk to the cheating wife. He's already judging her for heritage and the state that she is in. He returns the piece and is informed that Thomas died a year ago. Anon apologizes and goes back to his apartment where he hears the neighbor crying through the walls. Jason calls and he is back from Korea and he wants to go drinking with Anon. At the club, Jason talks about how he met this girl in South Korea that he had told he would stay with, but he couldn't stay longer than 2 weeks before leaving again, and he can't explain why. Anon is looking around the club, drinking, people watching, judging as always, when, quote, to my side, a fat man in a polo shirt attempts an unsuccessful conversation with a blonde 7 who's distracted by her smartphone. After politely entertaining his inane chattering, she leaves and he stymies a look of disappointment on his face. I see in his eyes the profound loneliness that often visits mine, and I motion to get his attention. Resting my hand on his shoulder, I lean forward and speak wisdom into his ear. I explain to him that, in effect, we are like brothers, organic forms engaged in heroic struggles against the callous vicissitudes of nature, and that, yes, I can see what he is trying to do, and I can share that I have made my ascent. Indeed, I have scaled the mountain, and brother, there is nothing there. He then finds a guy vomiting in the bathroom, looking half dead, and helps him get up, get a cab, making sure that he didn't seem to be on the brink of death. Then he heads home. Back in his apartment, he runs into the neighbor lady again, who is mourning the loss of her husband, and this is the ending of the book. Quote, I try to walk past her without making eye contact, aiming myself at the sliding doors. In theory, it should be a simple, thoughtless exercise to place one foot in front of the other and advance beyond the non-obstructing person sitting near my apartment's central opening. As I approach the sphere of her grief, my limbs pause of their own accord. A barrier is pushing me back from the edge of her awareness. It starts in my unconscious, but ends in my volition. Here, my body knows what I want before my mind does. What I want is something very simple. To study her pain without her noticing. To know her as others have failed to know me. Standing beyond her cone of vision, I'm able to mount an observation with relative ease. Locked in a memory, her eyes are stuck to her feet, and she is no longer cognizant of space, only time. Earlier today, I looked for her husband's obituary and found a blog that she'd written about his metastatic cancer, diarized by milestones of terminal decline. By the end, his muscles had almost completely atrophied, the wrinkled paper of his face sucking itself tight against his cheekbones, transforming him into a kind of living skeleton. In his final days, he was no longer able to recognize her face or her voice, and most of the time, he didn't even know where he was. At night, he often screamed uncontrollably, and no one could ever tell her why. In those moments, it seemed that nothing could bring him down from that plane of suffering. Even with her sitting right next to him, he was trapped alone in his agony and unable to reach her side. And yet, sometimes, when it seemed like he couldn't bear any more, she pressed her hand into his palm, and his fingers would curl around hers. Under the robe of his gown, his breaths would settle, and the moaning would stop, and for a time there would be calm. Even after all that he had lost, some part of him still remembered, still knew that she had stayed. And then he died. Tapping the shaft of her cigarette, she drops orange embers onto the concrete, watching as they burn into ashes. Drawing her knees in close, she hugs them like another person. A line of smoke fades into the apparition. I do not know how to pass her without exchanging words I am incapable of speaking. This alone does not prevent a conversation. In my head, I can hear her anyway. What's that, Anon? You thought that you were the only one in hell? She closes her face into her hands, as if to say, you're not alone. I'm right here with you. And that's the end of the book. I think that it is actually a very strong ending, especially in refutation of all of the characters' thoughts throughout the book, of the selfishness of the character throughout the book. I don't think that this book is about redemption. I think it is a story that is meant to show this character eventually by the end how wrong he is, though he has multiple people throughout, be it Andrew and his sister and then his neighbor, who all show him how wrong he is in different aspects. And he looks at Jason, and Jason doesn't have any answers. He admires Jason, who is just like him in some ways, though he thinks Jason is a cooler version of somebody like him, though inferior in other ways. And neither him or Jason have it figured out, and Jason obviously can't commit either because he is scared of something. So I think the ending of this is strong, and it hits in response to the last words that he said to Rachel. And it really makes him reflect on himself. And even the fact that the neighbor didn't say those words to him, but he looked at her and then he heard those words, and he's actually starting to see other people's plights at the end, shows a major difference for where he actually didn't see women as real people, or even he didn't see people in general as real people, because he looked at other men as tools to climb the social ladder to get to women. So he didn't see any human as worthy of anything but being a tool. And in the end here, he is actually starting to see more. So a couple of my thoughts on this in general is I thought the voice, obviously the prose and the character voice of this are very strong. They're very specific. There are so many quotes from the book because it is such a unique way of writing that is so specific to this character and obviously follows through. It also has, as I just discussed, a character arc, even though it's kind of only just starting at the end, but you do see a change. You do obviously have to deal with a lot of this character's being wrong, but I think that is the value in this type of story, and also reading contemporary fiction, is you get to see mindsets that are contemporary, that are kind of versions of what a population or a person, even a person, or even a person thinks today. And that's where this comes from because of the satirization of it. You got interesting narrative notes, like while women are being labeled by race and number, the men are described in very long paragraphs, showing that Anon actually observes and values men, but puts a number value very quickly on women. The only ones that he didn't were the ones that he marked off immediately. I don't think he numbered anyone lower than a 6.5. So like you have the woman with the pink hair and the masculine eyebrows. That was the description she got. And it's because she doesn't have any marketplace value to him. So you see that in the choices that it makes. Now, something that I think that this suffered from is that the plot got lost. Like from the very beginning, there was the plot, or the driving factor of the character kind of got lost throughout. And so it more meandered, and it was much more a slice of life than having something that drives you forward. And it felt distracted at times. It ended up feeling like vignettes with nothing pulling the pacing forward, when it actually could have had it growing and then being interrupted by these different things and still feeling that tension. It's one of the things that noted this for me is that it started out with something actually happening. In chapter 2, the Anon declared that he was either going to get laid or kill himself by his 23rd birthday. However, the sense of urgency of that was pretty much lost entirely going into the manifesto zone in certain places. And I'm not saying the author's manifesto, I'm saying the characters. I also think that it would have helped the tension of this book specifically if it changed the chapters to being titled by Days Until D-Day or Days Until the End, because it would have shown how close he was getting to his 23rd birthday, how close he was getting to dying. And I think a lot of people actually forget that you can use chapter titles to be a part of the story, to be a part of the setting. I often think of actually American Psycho, because if you look at the chapter titles of American Psycho, Bret Easton Ellis uses those to create the setting. Like it'll be a name of a place, and so then he doesn't have to tell you at the top of the the chapter where they are, or to describe where they are, or it is an event, because I think one of them is April Fool's. And so it'll tell you a time or a place to express passage of time or movement. And so I think this book could have actually used days counting down, much like Looking for Alaska that did. I have a couple of books. Predisposed to Bliss and The Westies are both going to be using dates to be the chapter headers because it'll show passage of time. And since, especially with The Westies, they're traveling around so much, it'll show travel as they pass through, as the chapter titles change. I believe I saw somewhere, it might have been in one of the reviews, that this book was put together with a bunch of different ideas that have been posted on 4chan or #lit. And #lit in various places. When I was reading, I could tell that it felt like it was separate ideas, and I wish that there had been more cohesion in the story of what Anon was wanting to accomplish, even if it was in the background. It can still be a character study with very minor things moving the character forward. Again, I think the framing of each chapter being a countdown and then afterwards being a count up to see how much time has passed once he hits his 23rd birthday would actually really help with showing, and how long, Jason was in Korea. That would also be reflected in using dates instead of chapters. Him trying to understand females in this very scientific way and truly believing in his idea of evolutionary/human psychology, while other things get in the way of his experiences, would still be the story. But you would still have it in the background constantly that he is thinking about, I am going to die. Because that was also mentioned in his chapter 2, where it is going to be put up against, I need to get laid or I'm going to die. And him constantly reminding himself of the ticking time bomb would have added to the pressure that he feels every day. Now, to me, who is the target audience of this book and what does it feel like? It feels like it was an observation of the incel community and an attempt to hold a mirror to them to see someone who acts or thinks like them, who shares their ideas. It feels like a projection done out of concern and care for certain people and wanting to help them see that the reason that they fail or are so lonely and has everything to do with their depersonalization of others and seeing others as tools. You get that in how many times Anon is refuted, especially with his sister constantly saying, you need to treat people like people. You've been online too much. And then by the end, when he is looking at the neighbor and he is finally starting to see her as a person. There's also this fear of intimacy that happens both physically because of him losing his physical excitement when he finally gets with a girl, with the effects of pornography on his mind because he has watched it so much he can't get hard for girls, and then also of the fear of being vulnerable because he starts imagining himself with this one girl that he thinks is out of his league, and he tells himself that no, you can't have her. If you're excited about her, then she's already gone. She's already lost because you don't want to make yourself vulnerable. So I think that's why there is the suicide hotline at the end, because the main audience for this book is people who are part of that mindset, and to kind of show them that you are the person making yourself miserable, especially with him at the end when he is seeing other people that were in his position from the beginning of the book, where he is like, brother, I have scaled that mountain and there is nothing there. You are making yourself miserable, saying that it'll be fixed when you finally have sex, but that is not going to fix it. I have been there. I am here to tell you that, brother. So that's kind of what makes me think that that is the target audience for this book. But it's interesting to look at the reviews, and I don't know how many of the reviews on Goodreads actually read this book as opposed to feeling like, hey, look, it's a book that kind of represents me, because this book does not side with incels, at least as far as I read it. With that said, give me your thoughts on the theme or the purpose of this read, of what you thought of the story overall. I think that the prose is very interesting, very unique, and I do think this author has skill. With that said, what do you think about it? Have you read this book? Will you read this book? Looking forward to your comments and the discussion down below. It is always interesting to me to find unique books and perspectives to discuss on the channel that seem not only thoughtful but sincere, and this book feels sincere to me. With that said, have a great weekend and don't die.
The only people who should come are those who want to meet their monsters.
If this is what Agatha wants, I don't know how we can even dispute it.
I change lives, baby.
And I end them. Sweetheart, no bargains hold. Only fools know restraint.
Only losers lose!
I've been under the knife so many times, I'm practically immune to it.
If your scissors are dull, May I recommend sharpening them with leather?
I think I hit you.
Mima says I must have a guardian angel.
To enter the ring but abstain from playing is suicidal. Your virtue makes you nothing but a liability.
You're gonna die. You're gonna die. You're gonna die.